So first things first, I can see the amount of views and length of those views on the YouTube videos. And what I have seen thus far is that the class is not participating. For instance, last Tuesday's upload has a total of 15 views, 2 of which are me. And of the other 13, there is an average watch time of 22 minutes, meaning that of the people who even watched, they're only watching about a quarter of the video. These are the lectures. You don't have a textbook because of the lectures. So participate, or it will show on your tests, which in fact there will be a quiz coming very soon, possibly next week. So pay attention, okay? Last Tuesday we left off talking about the conquistadors of and the creation of New Spain, especially here in New Mexico, which in fact Santa Fe is the oldest capital city of any state in the Union today, founded in 1607. But we'll be talking about other things than Spain today. So, of course, with Spain starting to get so many riches by conquering and exploring the interior of Central America and finding new mines like the silver mines that ended up actually kind of bankrupting China, the rest of Europe was looking on with jaded eyes. So New France in 1523 sent Giovanni de Verrazzo on an expedition to explore the North American coast. He was sent there by Francis I, and the expedition was paid for by France. In 1534, Jacques Cartier claimed the St. Lawrence River for France. Now, the St. Lawrence River is the river that begins in the Great Lakes and travels northward through like Montreal and Quebec. And this was the beginning of New France by staking a claim on the entirety of that river's basin. So in 1541, Fort Charlesbourg Royal was founded, which is now modern-day Quebec City. But it was quickly abandoned in a couple of years, and then eventually made into a trading post in the 1580s. By the end of the century, there was a permanent settlement in Tudossac, which is currently a suburb of Quebec, but in the early years, you'll find a lot of these cities were founded as separate places and then just grew into each other. And the official founding of Quebec itself is 1608. But quickly they were also reaching deep into the interior of America. For instance, what was called the Pays de Houx. I hope I'm saying it right. French doesn't really like to spell their words correctly. Makes it really difficult to figure out the pronunciation. But basically, the southern area of the Great Lakes was already being explored throughout the mid-17th century. So by the 1600s, there were traders making inroads all the way into the Great Lakes and into what we now call like Ohio. The Illinois Territory was quickly founded after that. And essentially all of this was on the merit of trying to find beaver. Because back in Europe, beaver pelts had gone dry by the late 16th century when Russia was trying to expand into its beaver territories and then basically hunted them out of existence. And so there was a new impetus to find beaver pelts in the Americas. And so those pelts would be used to make hats especially, but they'd be used for all kinds of different things. And so there was a real boom in the 17th century all the way into the mid-19th century to find beaver pelts. And that's really what drove France's trade and, conquest, I guess you could call it, in the Americas. Let's see. But of course, this meant that the way that they did this was setting up trading forts. That there were, this is what's called the factory system. Essentially, you set a fort down, place a few guys in there, and then trade with local tribes who would do the hunting for you, and you trade them trinkets or guns or anything kind of manufactured. And especially guns meant that people who were trading with the French were suddenly a lot more powerful and able to take more territory for their tribe. So this also started a series of wars called the Beaver Wars, which was essentially people, various tribes vying for control over the beaver trade. And while France would periodically ally with various tribes and, at other times try to make peace treaties between them, they were ultimately powerless to stop the carnage, and it became one of the worst wars in American history. But the problem is, these are tribes that, of course, are not writing at the time, and so we really only have French and English accounts of this. You can see pictured behind me that an example of one of these fights that was seen off the shore by an English vessel, and you can see that there is a Frenchman there aiding the Huron against the Iroquois. There's a couple off in the trees as well. But this is one of the few cases where they're allied, but they'd go back and forth between being allied and trying to negotiate peace. The Huron, in fact, ended up being almost wiped off the face of the map by Iroquois because the Iroquois had aid from English settlers, which we'll get to later. And the Iroquois became especially expansionist. They almost ended up taking all of Ohio in the process, and well all the way to the St. Lawrence River. So basically, they're from the backwoods of New York, maintaining basically the entire eastern side of New York at the time. But by the end of the Beaver Wars, they had stretched out all the way to Ohio and all the way to Montreal. So just a huge swath of territory, and purely by trying to wipe out all tribes in between. And this was purely so that they could gain more access to that beaver trade. But because the French were much more located with the Huron, they tried to ally with the Huron, even though the Huron were famous for cutting off the fingers of their missionaries. The French saw that it was better to ally with them, poor choice. They ended up having to increasingly try to make treaties to stop this carnage, and it didn't really work out because the Iroquois kept breaking those treaties over and over again. So this fur trade, while seemingly peaceful, since the French are just putting up forts and trying to trade in local regions, it is causing this massive wave of violence. They also, throughout all of this, let Jesuits do their thing and try to proselytize local tribes. And so Jesuit missions were placed throughout the region. But anytime the Jesuits set up a mission, they also required local tribes or neophytes, as we discussed last time, who had converted, to work on those missions. So this was actually kind of a labor system. And obviously, local tribes would often take offense to this. Hence, what I previously mentioned, the tribes the Huron who would cut off the fingers of missionaries who'd wander a little too far away from the mission. We're talking basically violent medieval times, and this is a tit for tat, right? Along with all this, because France was expanding into new territory, they ended up butting heads with Spain. So in 1564, they had created Fort Caroline in Spanish Florida, which was quickly massacred out of existence by the Spanish. They again tried in 1685 and found the city of New Orleans. But unfortunately, in 1685, they didn't actually land in New Orleans, they landed in Texas, which that will cause endless trouble leading all the way to the Mexican-American War in 1846, because France maintained a claim to Texas, even though they abandoned the colony after numerous raids by local tribes. Don't really have a record as to what happened, just a couple of people who had abandoned the colony and were living with the local tribe, and the Spanish coming up trying to actually massacre the French. Well, the local tribes beat them to it, and all but 2 people were killed. An inauspicious start to Texas history, right? Then in 1686, they founded a port in what is now Arkansas. 1699, they founded Fort Maurepas in modern Mississippi. 1702, Mobile, Alabama. And all the way into 1714 and 1718, they finally actually created New Orleans, which became the center of the southern part of the Louisiana Territory. So with all of that going on, of course, with their ancient rivalry with France, England decided to take part as well. England had a long history of conquest already in Europe. For instance, in 1169 to 75, Normans started conquering Ireland. The Normans who had just recently conquered England in 1066. And in 1529, they started conquering the rest of Ireland under the Tudor dynasty. So they had this long history of already using Ireland as basically a colony. But in 1497, they sent somebody of their own to go explore the new American coast, the New World. And Cabot, spelled C-A-B-O-T, name to remember, set sail from Bristol and ended up claiming what is now Newfoundland. So, interestingly enough, it's the same place where the Norsemen landed. Hold on a second. These masks make it a lot hotter, don't they? In 1559, Queen Elizabeth came to power and brought with her reforms such as the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity, which basically made England Protestant again. Since both France and Spain were Catholic, though France had its own troubles in terms of Protestantism, called the Huguenots, but for the most part they were either in the minority or fiercely suppressed. In England, on the other hand, these acts made England officially Protestant. And so, of course, they want to expand into the New World as well, but without what they called papistry, as in being too devoted to the Pope in Rome. At the same time, there was a bunch of fighting between the Dutch and Portuguese over succession, which led to Philip II of Spain, who also was the elector of the Netherlands, to oppose Queen Elizabeth directly, because he was Catholic, right? And he's trying to spread Catholicism throughout the New World. She's making official statements about Protestantism and everything along those lines. And, of course, she's meddling in the Netherlands. So, she was also meddling in the New World. Because in 1560, she had a group of guys that she called the Sea Dogs begin official privateering along what was called the Spanish Main. Now, the Spanish Main is essentially just the treasure galleons that would go from what is currently Mexico and sail all the way back to Spain. So these things were laden with treasure and just free for the taking, if you were bold enough. So these Sea Dogs would basically try to raid or at least harass the Spanish Main. And in 1577, she had Sir Francis Drake do his own form of what Magellan had done back in 1516 through 22, and he circumnavigated the globe, making a bunch of claims for the English crown, including of California. Though his actual claim plate, because one of the things they have to do to claim land according to their system at this time is you have to plant a flag, do some sort of ceremony. Most of the time the Spanish did like a mass, and you had to leave an object there to claim. the ye old plate of brass was supposedly found in the 1930s, but turned out to be a fraternity playing a trick on a historian who fell for it hook, line, and sinker and almost went to his death thinking that it was true. Even though printed on the back of the plate is literally the name of the fraternity. Oops. So we don't actually know what Drake called New Albion was, but also the Spanish had already laid claim to California at that point with Juan Cabrillo. But this was increasingly menacing Spain, under Philip II. Screwing with him in the Netherlands, screwing with him on the Spanish Main, sending people to lay claim to places he had laid claim to, making an issue of everything. But what really pushed it beyond the pale was what was happening up in Scotland. Because Mary, Queen of Scots, had basically been butting heads with the local aristocracy, and eventually they tried to imprison her multiple times. She escaped, she came back, yada yada yada. She finally tried to get to England after all this drama and hopefully get help from Queen Elizabeth, but instead she imprisoned Mary, Queen of Scots. And after a decade or so of that, with Mary, Queen of Scots actually supporting a few coup attempts on Queen Elizabeth and all that kind of stuff, this boiled over to a major plot in 1587, and a confirmed, because part of the problem was that Elizabeth couldn't clearly make these coups out to be Mary's fault, but instead, finally somebody actually had concrete proof showing that Queen Mary was actually trying to assassinate Queen Elizabeth, and so Queen Elizabeth assassinated her back and executed her in 1587. Notably taking 3 swipes at the head to do the deed. So why am I talking about all this? Well, Mary, Queen of Scots was Catholic. And, King Philip II didn't exactly like monarchs executing other monarchs, especially if that monarch who's doing the execution is a Protestant and the one being executed is a Catholic. So in 1588, Philip II sent an armada, a massive armada from Spain to try to invade England. And with something you have to understand about the English Channel is that there's a lot of fast-moving currents. It's kind of difficult to make landfall. Well, it's easy to make landfall in France. It's not so easy to make landfall in Britain. And of course, Britain had her own, I keep saying Britain, England had her own navy. In fact, her navy was led by Sir Francis Drake, who employed some rather innovative tactics, such as burning his own ships. You'd think that would be a bad idea, but you put a bunch of gunpowder in the hold of that ship, set it alight, and push it towards the enemy, suddenly it makes a great bomb. And so, because of this, the Spanish had to retreat, and they started trying to sail back around the British Islands. But unfortunately, the biggest cause of death wasn't the battle, but actually just a major storm. And so the fleet was broken. Hundreds of people were dead from this storm. Numerous boats, galleys, and ships were destroyed. It was a disaster. But then, literally a year later, England tried to capitalize on that by sending her own armada. Which, can you guess what fate befell that armada? Anybody? It ran into a storm, a bunch of the fleet was broken, hundreds of people were dead, so on and so forth. Same thing. This happened multiple times in a war that drew out throughout Queen Elizabeth's reign. She died in 1604, but from 1588 all the way to 1604, Spain and England were constantly butting heads and trying to invade each other and all that kind of stuff. So, with all of that going on, do you think Queen Elizabeth's just going to let the New World be? Or she might as well start her own colonies, right? So, even before the Armada started, in 1585, her favorite, which at the time was kind of a euphemism for her sexual partner, even though the name Virginia actually is supposed to relate to her being a virgin. Well, you can believe what you want. But her favorite, Walter Raleigh, who was also a sea dog, though he had never actually been to the New World at this point, but he sponsored a lot of privateering, was given a charter to go and found a colony. In 1586, they finally, in 1585, they arrived on what's now called Roanoke Island. Well, what they called Roanoke Island. But due to lack of supplies and fighting with a local tribe who would periodically come by and basically just take their wood. It wasn't actually much of fighting, it was basically just people coming and taking their wood. The colony was abandoned in 1586, and then a year later they founded a new settlement just up the island. Now, the reason why they chose Roanoke Island was because it was deep up the Chesapeake Bay. And that way, they could be hidden from any Spanish sailing up and down the coast. Because you have to remember, the Spanish are already in Florida. They're making their way up actually, by this time, they're already into Tennessee. So, they're deep inland, and so the English don't want to be found because they know they'll lose any fight with the Spanish. So, because of supposedly because of the Anglo-Spanish War heating up in 1588, the colony didn't receive any supplies that year. I say supposedly because there's a possibility that Walter Raleigh was kind of using this whole thing as a way of making money, and so he was taking payments from the crown and putting it in his own, and basically embezzling them, and he'd end up falling out of favor because of these allegations. But finally, in 1590, they get over there and find that the place is abandoned. There's several buildings that have been dug up or removed. There's random extra fortifications all over the place. And in one tree, they found a carving that said Croatan. spelled Croatoan. 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 The thing about the Croatoans is that they were just a neighboring tribe on a different island. So this has led to all kinds of speculation as to what happened. Were they saying that they were wiped out by the Croatoans? Did they go and live with the Croatoans? Nobody knows, and it's a huge mystery. But turns out that in 1595, Raleigh had lied about the search because instead of trying to search for, like, going to the Croatoans and just asking them, he decided to go to South America to look for the Fountain of Youth. Did this completely on a whim, and did not even seek approval. He did not find the Fountain of Youth. He did not find El Dorado, of course, because those things don't exist. So in 1603, the search failed. Another search failed to find these people. But mind you, 1603 is a lot longer. It's 13 years after 1590. So, yeah, the whole thing with Walter Raleigh doesn't seem to bode well for anyone who's working under him. So instead, in 1606, a joint stock charter was founded. Riley, in fact, actually tried to assert his control over this colonization attempt, except for nobody liked him anymore after all of these revelations came about. And in court, he was basically just told no. So this new colony was supposedly given the area between the 34th and 41st parallel. And supposedly, as according to the modification in 1609, from sea to sea. Now, this would include basically all of what is currently Georgia to Pennsylvania, and all the way over here. So that includes where we're living today in Albuquerque. Like, this is a huge blanket charter. And these kinds of things ended up causing a lot of friction between the colonies. So in 1606, they scouted the area, and a year later, they founded Jamestown. In 1608, they actually got resupply, and everything looked to be going well. But in 1609, the Sea Venture wrecked on a previously unknown batch of islands in the middle of the Atlantic. And that actually became a whole drama because they had to make their own ships to be able to sail away. It became such a controversy that Shakespeare actually started writing a play about it. Because of that, they didn't have any resupply that year, which led to what's called the starving times, aptly named because, well, they were too busy trying to find gold than to farm, to actually create the food they needed. Even though the local tribe had actually been fairly nice in helping them and trading with them and generally not like causing a fuss. But this became so bad that that a few of them even resorted to cannibalism. So in 1610, the colony was abandoned, but as they were trying to leave the colony, it was intercepted. And so the person intercepting them required them to go back, even though they're starving to death. But luckily, that ship that was intercepting them was also resupply. So they managed to survive the few that were left. And finally, in 1612, John Rolfe, who, by the way, if you've ever seen the movie Pocahontas, that's the one who should have been married, who actually got married to Pocahontas. He tried to, started trying to deal with the local tribe in terms of what could be grown there, and especially what was a good cash crop was tobacco. And so in 1612, tobacco became the primary thing that kept the colony alive. Not because they could eat it, good luck trying to survive by eating tobacco, but they could sell it and therefore didn't have to rely on the charter company back in England to send resupply ships. They could actually make enough money to pay for those resupply ships. So initially in Virginia, the Powhatan Confederacy, which was the local tribe, was actually very supportive of this effort, making treaties in terms of ceding land for the colonization effort, and basically seeing it as a way of establishing their power against other tribes. But remember, as we've seen with so many other colonies, it's basically this divide and conquer strategy, right? You have one tribe that sees an opportunity to gain power. They do gain power, but at the cost of driving away other tribes, and then eventually they end up butting heads with the colony, and it doesn't go so well for them. Kind of the same thing happened here. So, for instance, in 1607, Powhatans captured John Smith, guy who basically wrote the history of this initial founding. The problem with John Smith is he's kind of a self-aggrandizer. Like, for instance, every time he mentions a woman, he's always talking about how they were swooning for him. The guy had a bit of a flair for the dramatic. But he was captured by Powhatans and told to move the capital, which was Jamestown. But he refused. Pocahontas, supposedly the daughter of they called him the king, the chief, supposedly as he was about to be beheaded, threw herself over him to stop the beheading. Now we're talking about John Smith. You can't trust him. He honestly thought that Pocahontas was had a thing for him, even though she immediately turned around and married John Rolfe. So yeah, not really a trustworthy source. But this caused a bit of a rift, and the Powhatans started kind of raiding every once in a while, throwing fire over the stockades and whatnot. And this continued for a couple of years until the starving times began. And the Powhatans, seeing what was happening, just kind of took pity on them and stopped raiding for a couple of years. But in 1610, literally just a year later, but right after that resupply ship had come back, the new governor, Thomas West, sent attackers to go and hit back for all of the raids that the Powhatans had been doing prior to the starving times. And this was a continual war all the way until John Rolfe married Pocahontas in 1614. Now, sad thing about Pocahontas is that she and Rolfe actually tried to go back to England, but she quickly died of disease. As we had talked in the first lecture, these people are not adapted to European diseases yet, so they're very prone to mass dyings. And so, with all of that kind of stuff, there was peace for almost a decade. But, as the colony continued to expand, they found what was called New Plantation. Eventually, we call that place today Colonial Williamsburg. But with all of that kind of expansion on the peninsula there, the Powhatans are getting antsy. Even though they had technically ceded the land, they thought it was just to the few colonists who were there. Suddenly, there's a lot more of them, and they're surviving. So, what do you do when you see a growing power and you have a history of pushing out those growing powers? You try to push them out. See this pattern of divide and conquer and ending up backfiring? Well, this happened again. And in 1622, the Powhatan Confederacy tried to overrun the Jamestown. And this developed into a huge massacre. 347 people were killed in the process of this. It was a massacre unheard of at the time, because we'll get to the other colony that was founded at this point. But that other colony had its troubles, but nothing like this. 347 people. And so this turned, so that didn't wipe out Jamestown, though it sent it into a steep decline for a little bit. But instead, they started a whole cycle of raid and counter-raid. Basically, you send a raiding party into their village, burn a few freaking houses. They do the same, kill a few people there, kill a few people there. Back and forth. They did this for 10 years. And this was finally starting to wear down the Powhatan Confederacy, but not enough to stop them from severely hurting the colony and hindering it from growing any further. So in 1634, the Virginia colony erected a 6-mile palisade across the entire peninsula. But even though they had created this thing to try to maintain peace and stop this whole cycle of raid and counter-raid, it worked for a little bit. But yet again, in 1644, the Powhatans tried to massacre all the colonists, killing around 400 this time, which led to a bunch of reprisals. And finally, in 1646, after decades of all this, the colony of Virginia signed a treaty with the Powhatan Confederacy, officially making them vassals of England, because they had finally managed to subdue the tribe. So, with all of this kind of stuff going on, there was also an attempt to expand the colony's influence. So, there was a couple of towns founded. For instance, in 1611, they founded the first one called Henricus, which was essentially a swamp colony, I guess you could call it. They were trying to drain the swamp, didn't work out so well. In 1613, they founded City Point, which is now called Hopewell, which was created to overlook Jamestown on a hill. And in 1632, they created Middle Plantation, which was founded on New Plantation and then eventually Colonial Williamsburg. But Middle Plantation was the first time it was a separate town. Also, in 1619, the colony got its first shipment of slaves. As we saw, the Spanish had already been doing this for quite a while, since 1501, so more than a century. And, in fact, they had already received several indentures. Now, indenture is not slavery. In fact, most of the indentures at this point were white, but it was essentially a way of paying for voyage across the sea. But a lot of early, what we would call Creoles, came along with it. So there were quite a mixture of labor systems inside of this colony. But in 1619, it's the founding of American slavery, because this is the first transatlantic slave passage. Now, mind you, they had already enslaved some Powhatans as a cause of war. It was standard practice at the time to enslave POW, prisoners of war. In fact, John Smith supposedly was enslaved for a little bit as a part of his capture. This is just how warfare was done at the time. In fact, a lot of the African slaves who were shipped across the Atlantic were also POWs. That's essentially the foundation of the trade, warfare. But what's especially different about this is that these people are being shipped from their homeland, from their home continent, to a completely foreign place with a foreign language and no recourse. Because if they try to escape, they're just going to run into the Powhatans. And if they try to organize, they have a bit of a language barrier. So this entire system was founded on it also on them being foreign. Very easy way to maintain oppression. But because of the Powhatan Wars, in 1622, the Virginia Company was dechartered. And it officially became a crown colony. Now, what that means is that the colony has a governor that is appointed by the king or queen, in this case, the king, that governor has complete control. So it is basically direct control by the crown. Also in 1632, they created Maryland, which was the next southern colony, basically as a refuge for English Catholics, so that because England had been having severe persecution against Catholics, despite the fact that their king at this point is a Catholic. But because of this persecution, they figured they can send the Catholics over there to either labor as indentured servants, or once they finish their indenture, which often came with a tract of land. So, by the way, an indenture meant that you were basically bonded to labor for a certain period of time. These indentured contracts ranged between 1 year and 5 normally. They were somewhere in between, normally on the lower end. Sometimes they would actually do this as punishment. For instance, rebellions later on in the 17th century would result in 25-year indenture as punishment. Like they would be assigned to be transported as the official punishment was. But you had to pay for that transport, and when you're being punished, the person who's negotiating that contract has complete power over you, and so you end up getting the absolute maximum, basically a lifetime. But that mostly didn't go on in the Virginia colony or any of the southern colonies or anything that would become the 13 colonies. These folks were normally going to the Caribbean, Barbados and Jamaica and places like that. So normally not really a thing in North America. But what happened after they finished these contracts in Maryland, these shorter ones when they were just Catholics trying to escape persecution, they'd get a tract of land, and of course, then buy slaves so that they didn't have to work any further. So the system becomes self-perpetuating. First you pay into the system by being like a temporary slave, I guess you could call it, but it's not slaves. Slavery requires you to be owned as property rather than contracted. Whereas indenture means that you're contractually obligated. Here, these people would still see themselves as slaves, right? But only for 2 or 3 years. And then they buy African slaves so that they can just own slaves perpetually. Because if you own property, then whatever that property makes is still your property. So this also meant that there was a bunch of land that could be used for more of this cash crop system, because remember, Virginia was creating tobacco. Wish we had a clock in here. Okay. Yeah, we're not going to get through this at all. So the Carolinas were founded in 1629. Now, at first they were one colony, but quickly they were split up. And also in 1663, there was creation of South Carolina specifically as a bulwark against Spanish Florida. All of this is happening in southern, in the southern colonies. Basically, they're founded as these cash crop creating places. Mostly tobacco. But in the north, a completely different system came about. So in 1602, the first attempt was a little island called Cuttyhunk. They have some very funny names up in New England, which was basically just a fishing encampment. Didn't last very long. In 1604, there was St. Croix Island, which was another colony that was attempted but quickly abandoned. And finally, this is the first incarnation. In 1606, the Plymouth Company was chartered to colonize between the 38th and 45th parallel. Remember how the Virginia colony claimed all that land all the way to like California? This had the same kind of mass claim, but this time all the way from what is now Maine, no, actually further up into Newfoundland, and all the way down to what is now Pennsylvania. It's actually crossed a little bit in Pennsylvania with the Virginia claims, but since Virginia got dechartered in 1622, it doesn't really matter. This time they tried to create a colony under a guy named Poffin, but here they were also trying to make it into a colony that was creating cash crops or finding gold. They didn't find any gold, didn't have any cash crops, and so it was abandoned in 1608. The company was dechartered in 1620, but a group of, basically we could call them religious zealots, were creating their own scheme of colonization. In 1559, a bunch of them were exiled, and remember, this is a bunch of exiles returned to England right at the same time as Queen Elizabeth was coming to power. But they started seeing Queen Elizabeth as not being pure enough. She's not supportive of true Protestantism. These are hardcore Calvinists. And so in 1603, they petitioned the new king, James I, to take a more extreme stance on the Church of England. And in 1605, they had enough of it and separated from the Church of England. This specific congregation is called the Scrooby congregation. I don't know why they all have silly names. And so they quickly emigrated to Holland in 1607. But there, they also had the same problem because, those dang people in Holland are just are too ungodly. So in 1619, a guy named John Carver and Robert Cushman secured a charter from the Plymouth Company. So they were told that they could what's called take a patent, as in a particular plot of land along that charter, and found their own colony specifically to practice their much more purified Christianity. And so they took a leaky vessel called the Speedwell to England to catch up with the Mayflower. This Mayflower set sail in 1619, but didn't arrive until 1620, which they quickly tried to explore Cape Cod once upon arrival, but only found an abandoned fort of unknown origin. Remember, the Spanish, the French, even previous English attempts are noted, but like some of these things just don't go recorded. And so they signed a compact aboard the vessel for everyone there, saying that they formed a covenant combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. They wintered on the ship for that year, and almost had about half of them die in the process. But in the following spring, when they finally venture off the boat, a man named Samoset made contact with the Puritans. This was a local Indian. He and a few others had actually already had plenty of contact with Europeans, and in fact the tribe had experienced a mass die-off about a decade prior. So the land was pretty much abandoned, and you had a few people who could actually speak Spanish or English, but especially a guy named Squanto had been captured twice and enslaved once, one of which was on a ship that was with that same John Smith guy from the Virginia colony. This is the one that enslaved Squanto. But Squanto had been returned just recently and could speak English. Seeing the difference in the way that these people were, they weren't searching for gold, they weren't trying to be conquerors or anything along those lines. They weren't trying to grab up local tribesmen as slaves or anything along those lines. The local tribe decided to actually deal with these folks. The tribe's name is Wampanoag. And so the Plymouth colony quickly formed an alliance with the Wampanoag. And so they in 16 hold on a second. Yeah, in 1620, there was a bit of an issue that when the exploration party was going around, they had grabbed up some seeds. Turns out that was on another tribe's land. So this ended up planting seeds of conflict to come. And in 1622, a boy was captured and by the local Nar, a rival tribe, but quickly negotiated back. But a bunch of squabbling took place, and eventually the colony had to make an alliance between the Wampanoag and Nar. Because of all this happening, and the fact that the Pilgrims themselves didn't have any kind of provisions besides what they took on the Mayflower, the Wampanoag took pity on them and brought food on a regular basis. But especially in November of 1621, what is called the first Thanksgiving happened, where Wampanoag brought basically a feast of especially local fruit and the all-important corn or maize. At this point, by the way, corn meant any kind of bread stuff. For instance, all the way into the 19th century, there would be what were called corn laws, and that just was a regulation on breadstuffs. So we use the term corn in a very different way that they would have. They would have used the term maize. the colony was established pretty much because of this alliance, and they could maintain it because of it. So more Puritans started moving in. Problem is, that first little congregation was a tight-knit group who had survived tremendous things. Quickly, people started forming different colonies. So in 1620, the Council of New England was founded by the Plymouth Company. And it basically was the thing that would charter new colonies. So in 1622, for instance, there was the Wessagusset colony, but that quickly failed a year later. And in 1625, there was the Marymount Puritans who became displeased with the local commander there named Miles Standish, and so they founded their own colony. It didn't last very long. And finally, in 1630, the Massachusetts colony was founded. Now, the Massachusetts Bay colony became the more powerful of all the different New England colonies. So there was other ones, such as the 1636 founding of Connecticut, and the same year, the founding of Rhode Island, although there had already been colonies on Rhode Island that had failed or became incorporated with it. And because of all this, this basically became a hotspot for Puritanism. They ruled basically theocratically, with direct influence from Puritan pastors who would impose kind of ridiculous laws like outlawing Christmas, because Christmas was seen as a festival of debauchery. Imagine Christmas where the standard is that you go to everybody's house, get drunk, go to the next house, continue getting drunk, eat to your heart's content, and, all the stuff that comes with getting drunker and drunker. So, theocratic Puritans or puritanical society obviously doesn't like that. They also created Harvard College in 1636, and mandated that everyone have windows that could be seen through. So, literally so that people could come and spy on you. Not exactly a nice place to live. But that's essentially how Puritanism worked. It's like you have to be absolutely pure all the time. But, of course, when you have that much zealotry, there was quickly huge disputes. So in 1636 through 38, there was the Free Grace controversy, where John Cotton said that there would be that people could have separate congregations that essentially espoused that grace was given freely by God and that it wasn't the select. Very erudite arguments, but this also meant that the church ended up splitting over what's called the Antinomian controversy. This planted the seeds of being able to have New England for things other than Puritanism, because now the power is getting split up. The local tribe in Connecticut called Pequots started having trouble trying to fend off all this expansion. And in 1636, the Pequots started raiding. And so the English turned around a year later, after having dealt with a few dozen of their own getting killed, turn around and try to massacre the Pequots out of existence by killing around 400 to 700 of them. So don't take the Puritans' word for it. They're not exactly peaceful people. But that's kind of the cycle of everything, right? You have this expansion that eventually aggravates the local tribe. The local tribe tries to take it out on the colony, and the colony fiercely retaliates. In 1643, especially after all this had happened, New England created its own confederation. So all the colonies actively worked together and pledged their militias to a singular cause. Now this would become a problem, but I think we have ran out of time. So with the couple of minutes we have left, first, any questions? All right, so we have the establishment of New England and the establishment of the southern colonies. Next time we'll talk about the establishment of New Netherlands and basically how all of this is kind of connected. Have a good day.